Lunchtime Forum. All right, let's start again. Welcome everybody to Brain Health and You, a lunchtime forum. We're glad that you could join us this afternoon for a lunchtime of information for the brain. Your moderator this afternoon is going to be Kate Zhong. But first, I just want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. And with that, I would like to present Kate Zhong. She's currently an adjunct professor here at UNLV, but so much more. So Kate, I'll let you take it away and tell them a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you, Andy. Welcome, everyone. So welcome to the Brain Health and You Lunch Forum, brought to you by UNLV. We are very excited to kick off this brand new initiative today. This is a monthly lunchtime conversation with the expert to discuss issues that's so important to all of us, brain health. As Andy said, I am your host and your moderator, Dr. Kate Zhong. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist. I am the Director of Innovation at the Chambers-Grundy Center for Transformative Neuroscience with Department of Brain Health and UNLV. September is the World Alzheimer's Month. Yesterday, September 21st, was the World Dementia Day. Around 55 million people live with dementia in the world, and that number is going to rise to about 80 million in just 10 years, and it will reach to 140 by 2050. Pretty alarming numbers for sure. But the good news is that up to 40% of the dementia cases could be prevented or delayed through lifestyle intervention. Isn't that exciting? That's what we will be discussing in this series. On the fourth Wednesday of every month, at lunch hour this time, experts from UNLV and potentially some other institutions will be right here to discuss various topics from how to take care of your brain, what's new in the Alzheimer's world, to what you can do to stay sharp and healthy. You will walk away not only with the latest scientific information from the trusted sources, but also with the practical tips and recommendation on how to live a healthy lifestyle. So please remember to zoom in on the fourth Wednesday in the following quite a few months. So today we will be discussing brain health and diabetes. Joining me are our two distinguished speakers, Dr. Jeff Cummings and Dr. Kenny. Dr. Cummings is a neurologist, the leading expert in Alzheimer's disease and on the development of new therapies for brain disorders. He is the director of the Chambers-Grundy Center for Transformative Neuroscience and UNLV. Dr. Jeff Kenny, we have two Jeffs here today. Dr. Kenny is a founding chair of the Department of Brain Health in the School of Integrated Health Sciences. He's also the director of the Translational Biomarker Discovery Laboratory. His research focuses on mechanism underlying Alzheimer's disease. Today, we also have some of our future speakers here joining us as well. So they will be happy to answer a lot of questions you may have. So they are physiotherapists, occupational therapists, neuropsychologists, and nutritionists. So welcome you all. Please remember to ask questions in the chat features so that I will kick off the discussion with the two Dr. Jeffs. And then as we get more questions coming in, we will be happy to address those questions. Our goal is to make this as a very engaging and interactive discussion forum. So welcome, Dr. Cummings and Dr. Kenny. Dr. Cummings, I'm going to start with you first. We know that Alzheimer's and type 2 diabetes are two most common diseases in the elderly population. Can you share with us what is the link between diabetes and dementia and why is it important?
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for having me with you today. Great to see everyone online, so this is terrific. The link between Alzheimer's disease and diabetes is so important, Kate, because they are two common diseases, and diabetes is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And you mentioned a tremendous number of patients who could develop Alzheimer's disease in the coming years. And part of that is attributable to the rising rate of diabetes in the population. So we know that diabetes is a risk factor. I think Dr. Kinney will tell us much more about the mechanisms of that. But what we know is that not only does diabetes increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease, but diabetes also increases the risk of all-cause dementia because it is also a risk factor for stroke and vascular dementia. So there are many interactions between diabetes and Alzheimer's disease that make make diabetes a very substantial risk factor for Alzheimer's disease.
Thank you, Dr. Cummings. Dr. Kinney, I understand that your lab has done a lot of work in this particular area, the linkage between Alzheimer's and diabetes. Can you share with us?
Yeah, so I also will say thank you for joining this call and thank you for inviting me to chat a little bit here about some of our work. So as Kate points out, we actually do have a number of research projects where we're trying to find the connection between why diabetes confers increased risk. Now, it does increase risk, but it's not causal by any direct measure. But one of the key questions is how does having diabetes, and in particular type 2 diabetes, increase the risk towards Alzheimer's disease? And some of the work that we've done in our research projects is really trying to understand what mechanisms that we see in diabetes are also some of the same ones that we see in Alzheimer's populations. Like most researchers, we have models that we are trying to investigate and hypotheses we are trying to test. One of the core features that we've discovered in the last few years is that one aspect of diabetes, which is hyperglycemia, so elevated blood glucose. And I really emphasize this because while only about 9% of the overall population have type 2 diabetes, age 65 and older, it's nearly 25%. So this is an age-associated change. And in fact, age is also a risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. So this one feature of diabetes of having sustained blood glucose, and some modeling work that we have done actually induces some changes that are consistent with what we see in Alzheimer's disease models as well. So a lot of this work is trying to connect between what consistent hyperglycemia may induce and may potentially seed the ground for what happens in Alzheimer's disease.
Thank you. That's an astonishing number, isn't it? About a quarter of people who are over age 65 and older would have type 2 diabetes. That's obviously a very epidemic issue here. So thank you for the research that you have just shared with us. With regard to the elevation of the glucose in the blood, Dr. Cummings, I wonder if you can talk a little bit from the clinical perspective. What does that mean when people talk about the increase of the glucose in the blood, and why does it happen in the diabetes patient, and why would that be a risk factor for Alzheimer's?
Yes, thank you. I have to say I'm not a diabetes expert, and so I can only give you the Alzheimer's disease end of this. Of course, diabetes is associated with elevated blood sugars, as it is in the models that Jeff discussed, and that's why people take insulin so that the cells can utilize the sugar that is available better. And that's also why they take non-insulin anti-diabetic agents, is to increase the ability of cells to use glucose. So in the brain, there's also an inability to use glucose in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And when I say glucose, I mean sugar. And sugar is the basis for energy generation in the brain. So the patient with Alzheimer's disease has insulin resistance. And that's one of the reasons that we're looking more closely at the potential role for treatments of diabetes in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. So if there is insulin resistant peripherally and we use these agents, then could we use them in Alzheimer's disease, where we have the central insulin resistance? The other point I'd make, Kate, and this is something that I learned from Jeff, is that hyperglycemia induces inflammation peripherally. And inflammation then is itself destructive, and it also interrupts the proper function of the blood-brain barrier. And that's another aspect of how it adversely affects brain function and accelerates Alzheimer's disease. So there are many complicated intersections between diabetes, hyperglycemia, and inflammation, all of which tend to exaggerate Alzheimer's disease.
That's so interesting, Dr. Cummings. I just want to reiterate what you said. You mentioned that in the Alzheimer's patient, they actually have insulin resistance, just as this is the case in the type 2 diabetes patient. So that's fascinating. And
to make that point, they have insulin resistance in the brain.
In the brain.
They don't have general insulin resistance.
That's fantastic. So speaking of the inflammation, I wonder if Dr. Kenny can elaborate a little bit about your research.
Yeah, so inflammation is really the centerpiece of a lot of what it is that we're working on. So as Dr. Zhong, Dr. Cummings can highlight as well. So there are really now 3 core pathologies in Alzheimer's disease. Most people are familiar with the plaques that exist, usually referred to as amyloid beta plaques. Something is referred to as neurofibrillary tangles, which are proteins that aggregate within cells in the brain. And then over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been this real discovery of a chronic inflammatory response that persists in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. And a lot of the investigations of this have really demonstrated that this sustained inflammatory response is contributing to the 2 other core pathologies. And moreover, may even be a link between both the plaques themselves, which are those large masses outside of cells in the brain, and the tangles that are within them. So there seems to be some sort of connection between them. So our group, as well as a lot of others, have really honed in on trying to understand what role inflammation plays both in Alzheimer's disease, but it also provides a window to be able to look at the things that confer risk for Alzheimer's disease and how they may either lay the foundation for what develops in terms of Alzheimer's disease, or at least contribute to really the onset of it. So in the case, and Jeff highlighted this very nicely, one of the things that we see in our work is that in these hyperglycemic models, we see an inflammatory response in the brain that persists, and it's very similar to what's seen in Alzheimer's disease models. So if you couple some of that inflammation work with some of the other pathological features that we look at, there is considerably more overlap between these 2 disorders than anyone really gives them credit at first glance. And this becomes really useful both for understanding the disease, but as it enters Dr. Cummings' area of expertise in particular, it also provides an opportunity to talk about novel ways to treat the disorder, but even more so, perhaps ways to preemptively do things that may decrease risk, or preemptively do things that can serve an advantage so we get fewer patients, which is exactly what Dr. Zhong highlighted at the very beginning of this.
Well, I think that sounds so interesting, Dr. Kenny. So the increase of the sugar in the blood, as well as the inflammation, could be potentially both culprit for Alzheimer's patient as well as for diabetes. So that then in terms of the intervention, if we can stabilize the blood sugar level, if we can actually reduce the inflammation, so that sounds like potentially could be a very effective way of preventing and potentially reducing the risk for both Alzheimer's and diabetes.
So absolutely, and I think something to highlight along those lines is, so we talk about the number of people that have type 2 diabetes, which really just means blood glucose levels are above some threshold. Beyond that large number of individuals, there are, I think the last estimate was 88 million people in the United States who are considered pre-diabetic, meaning that their blood glucose is not yet to that threshold, but it's still elevated. And if all of this is a combined overlapping pathways that may convene on Alzheimer's disease, it means that that sort of intervention is even more needed.
That's such a staggering number. I think there was a question from one of the audience asking about if there could be a difference with regard on the diabetes from the ethnic background perspective, we actually have Dr. Samantha Jones here. Samantha, I wonder, that's one of her expertise area, and that's a research area she's been focusing on. Dr. Jones, I wonder if you can just share with our audience a little bit on this particular subject.
Yeah, thanks, Kate, for inviting me here today and to the conversation. So I specialize in neuropsychological or cognitive functioning. I study things like memory and different cognitive abilities. And in particular, I look at how those cognitive abilities and the risk for Alzheimer's disease might vary across ethnic and racial groups. And so with respect to both Alzheimer's disease as well as diabetes, we see that certain groups face a disproportionate or higher risk for developing the two disorders. And so in particular, Hispanic Latino individuals are at a greater risk of developing both diabetes as well as Alzheimer's disease. That's also true for Black African American individuals that face greater risk. Part of this, to address the question in the chat, part of this is likely related to lifestyle factors, things like diet availability and accessibility of some preventative, both medications and sort of access to medical care. And we don't believe this to be genetically linked, but also we have a real shortage of research in diverse populations. So we don't have great answers for why the disproportionate risk exists across different racial ethnic groups.
I think that's the area needs more study, isn't it?
Okay, maybe I could make one point to add to what Dr. John said. Another way these diseases interact that has been shown is that people who are cognitively impaired, even mildly so, have difficulty remembering to take their medications. So the control of diabetes, once the dementia begins to exert itself, is also further compromised. And of course, the worse the diabetic control is, the more likely they are to have cognitive symptoms. So this really becomes a very negative interaction as both diseases become more severe.
That's a great point, Jeff. Thank you for bringing that up. On the medication management, I'm actually going to bring one of our occupational therapists, Dr. Kraus, to actually address this very specific issue with regard to the medication management for Alzheimer's patient, for cognitive impaired patient, and coupled with the diabetes. Obviously, you know, the accurate management of medication is so key to stabilize a blood sugar. Donna?
Thank you, Kate, for inviting. I really appreciate the opportunity to share. As an occupational therapist, we really look at providing ability where there is inability. And so when it comes to medication management, some of the side effects for diabetes is vision loss, sensory loss. So we find adaptive ways to teach people how to be able to take their medication. It may be through an electronic aid that sets off an alarm. It may be through a different measure if they've lost vision or compromised, in addition to compromised sensation, lost vision as well. So we find ways around that the patient may be motivated in order to decrease those risk factors and stay able and to engage their occupations.
Thank you. In terms of reducing risk and potentially preventing the onset of dementia, so that we have talked quite a bit about the lifestyle intervention among the group, and there have been a lot of evidence supporting that. On that, you know, obviously physical exercise is critically important. There are some very large studies showing that even just 30 minutes a day and 5 days a week can potentially reduce the risk down to 50% for those patients who were pre-diabetic to develop type 2 diabetes. And we know it's critically important also in terms of managing their eating habit and their diet. So today we have our physical therapist as well as our nutritionist. I'm going to bring them on board as well, just to address a little bit in terms of the importance of exercise and how do we advise people to get engaged to be more physically active. So I'm going to bring Dr. Jennifer Nash to just talk a little bit about the importance of physical exercise.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Zhong, for inviting me to this forum. I do believe exercise is something that everyone can engage in and should try to engage in daily. We encourage them to do just like what you said, be active at least 5 days a week. I always like to encourage my patients and my families and friends to have a variety of activities that they like to be involved in. I tend to like swimming, running, and bicycling. Others like yoga and walking and hiking. All of those, any of those activities that get you moving are going to be helpful in this fight to regulate our blood sugar and to keep our brain as active and as clear as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Nash. I know that Dr. Housekeeping also has been studying, particularly in terms of some underlying mechanism as to why the physical exercise is very beneficial for diabetes patients, those particularly who have compromised way of utilizing glucose. Dr. Housekeeping?
Thank you, Kate. Yes, exercise is medicine. So exercise is good for everybody, but specifically for people with pre-diabetes or diabetes, exercise provides another mechanism to help control glucose. So for people who are struggling with insulin and are insulin resistant, exercise provides a way to absorb glucose from your blood without the use of insulin. So it helps you control your glucose levels up to 2 hours after you exercise and up to 24 hours effects after intense exercise. So really exercise is one of the other strategies that you can use if you're pre-diabetic or diabetic to help control your blood glucose levels.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask Jennifer whether typing counts as exercise, or do you think it has to be more vigorous than that?
Oh, thank you, Dr. Cummings. So glad that you brought that up. I actually don't think that would be something you can include in that 30 minutes of exercise you should get daily. You really want to get that heart pumping if you can.
You can combine typing with exercise though.
you might get a treadmill, right?
That's a great idea.
There you go.
That's fascinating. I wonder if we have any information on with regard to exercise and the anti-inflammatory property. Jeff.
So I can take a quick step. So it's safe to say that way more research in that is needed. There is some substantial evidence that shows regular exercise reduces inflammatory signaling. In addition to, so the fancy word, which Tessa just said very nicely, which is the insulin independent way of clearing glucose, is that it does tend to decrease inflammation. It's a little bit tied together because when you exercise, you also evoke some inflammation in muscle groups by having them being active. So it becomes a little hard and intertwined, but there are definite benefits for it without any doubt.
Dr. Cummings, I know that the finger study, one of the largest studies showing the benefit of the lifestyle intervention on the overall cognition, one of the pillars is physical exercise. Can you share with the audience a little bit in terms of the benefit of physical exercise on reducing risk for dementia, specifically for Alzheimer's disease?
Sure. So you mentioned the finger study, Kate. So maybe it's good to expand a little bit because it's one of the major sources of information that we have, one of the major studies for insight into this. And finger, the fins, because it was a Finnish study, is where the fin of finger comes from. And these were patients who were either very mildly impaired or at risk for impairment. And they were put on a 2-year regimen of exercise, improved diet monitoring, and improved vascular risk factor monitoring, like hypertension, hypercholesterolemia. There was a control group then, very important. So there's a group that did get the intervention and a group that did not, and then you compare them to see how they did. And the group that received the intervention over a 2-year period had an improvement, not just a slowing of decline, but an actual improvement in their cognition. Interestingly enough, to me, it was least on memory, and it was most on things like decision-making and what we consider frontal lobe function. So insight and judgment, those were the things that could be measured that showed improvement in the course of the finger study. But it is one of the major pieces of information that reinforces what Jen told us about the importance of exercise and the importance of consistency of exercise in terms of reducing the risk both for cognitive decline, but also specifically for Alzheimer's disease.
Thank you, Jeff. That's great elaboration on such an important study. I think that's really the foundation of many studies that we are currently involved.
Yeah, maybe I could just say one more thing about that, which is the study was run by Mia Kilpapelto, a very competent woman investigator from Finland, and she has since expanded this to a global study, which in the U.S. is called the Pointer study. So now we're looking at not only those Northern European populations, but if you put these interventions into a more global population, do you see the same kind of benefit? So I think in another year or two, we'll have more information about the finger type of intervention.
Thank you. So I would like to introduce a couple of questions coming through the chat. And one of which is a question about how much of a factor is genetics when it comes to Alzheimer's. This individual said my mother's father had it, while I don't see any warning sign in my mother's or brothers. I'm just curious. This is a question that we get all the time. How much is genetic? How much is environmental or some other factors? Dr. Cummings, may I ask you to take that on first?
Sure. So I'm sure other people will have an idea about this as well. There are a very few cases, maybe around 3%, in which Alzheimer's disease is directly inherited by an abnormal gene. And every child of a parent who has that abnormal gene is at 50% risk of getting the gene, and if they get it, they will inevitably get Alzheimer's disease, and they will do so by around age 50. So this is the most aggressive, most young onset form, but it's very rare, only about, as I say, 3% or less of all cases of Alzheimer's disease. Now, in the cases that are not directly caused by a mutation of the gene, there are still powerful genetic influences. In particular, people who have what's called the apolipoprotein 4 gene, and we shortened that, so we call it ApoE4. So if people have the ApoE4 gene, they are much more likely to get Alzheimer's disease, to a point that roughly 60% of Alzheimer patients have that gene. So it's very powerful, and it is the most common reason for observing Alzheimer's disease in families. It's a very special kind of gene in that it increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease, but it does not specifically cause the disease. So you can have the gene without getting Alzheimer's disease. But if you have the gene, your chance of getting it is much higher than if you do not have the gene. So that's why we consider it a risk gene, and we do often evaluate it. It is available as a commercial test, the E4 test. You can even get it from 23andMe. And I have no interest in 23andMe, by the way, no financial interest there. But we don't encourage it because we do not have a specific intervention for ApoE type of Alzheimer's disease or ApoE associated Alzheimer's disease. So we would tell people to do exactly what we've just heard: exercise and great diet, whether or not they have the E4 gene. So in some research projects, we are very attentive to the presence of the gene, but in general, in clinical care, we do not encourage people identifying themselves as being E4 carriers.
Thank you, Dr. Cummings. Dr. Kinney, I know that your lab also has done some work identifying specific genes and some biomarkers. I wonder if you can just provide some update on that.
Yeah, I think as a continuation of what Dr. Cummings was just highlighting. So, I mean, ApoE4 is certainly the clearest risk factor gene, but as age, as diabetes, as some other things, they all confer risk. Where this, I think, gets particularly interesting is that ApoE4 is actually associated with, or at least a lot of the literature is pointing towards it, contributing to cholesterol management, as well as some potential links to what may be tied to diabetes. So there may be some overlap across some of these risk factors. Certainly age and type 2 diabetes are overlapping. Another one of the interesting genes to the question that was asked, and this is really the backbone of some of this focus on inflammation. About 10 years ago, this entire research field was upended by the discovery of a very rare mutation on myelinoid cells, which are really just immune cells, that if this rare mutation it confers a much higher increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Some people have heard of TREM2. This is the mutation for it. But what it largely did is it really opened up a lot of our focus towards some of the inflammatory signaling component of it as well. In terms of other biomarkers, there are a number of candidates that are in the works. Right? So by biomarker, we really just mean the ability to detect something from a patient that if you have high blood pressure, you put a cuff on and you can detect, that's a biomarker of high blood pressure. You can detect the elevated blood pressure, right? With Alzheimer's disease, this is much more difficult, but there are a number of proteins, a number of targets that range from inflammatory markers to proteins that are involved in cell function. And there's been a lot of progress in this in the last few years about a combined biomarker that a couple companies now are saying that they have set, which looks at amyloid levels, and this can be done from a blood draw. There are also a few really promising ones that I think are on the verge of this, to where we can really combine the clinical assessment that is done with biological measures from blood samples to be able to better identify and detect Alzheimer's disease.
Thank you, Dr. Kinney. I know that's a neuroscientist talking.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jeff.
One point I'd like to make, people often think, well, if it's a gene or if it's hereditary, it's fate, and therefore there's nothing I can do about it. But as you know, our colleague, Stephen Rao, has done exercise studies, and what he's shown is that the people who have the gene have a bigger effect from the exercise than people who don't have the gene. So you just see this, this fact that the exercise can be very powerful, even if you have a genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So I think that's an important observation, that even though this gene is quite common in Alzheimer's disease, it doesn't eliminate the benefit of a lifestyle adjustment.
So it's a risk gene, but doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get it, even if you have that gene.
That's right.
Speaking of genes, we have a question from Dr. Jen. Long time ago, I heard that we have something called the anti-diabetes genes that is turned on by exercise. Anyone may have some comment and insight into this?
So I can take the first swipe at this, and then Tessa or anyone else, if you want to jump in as well. So an anti-diabetes gene is kind of difficult to sort of identify, but there are a couple genes that have a function with zinc, and zinc then interacts with how insulin receptors work. So there is a little bit of an A to B and B to C of exercising influencing the expression of some of these genes that can help with insulin processing and insulin function. It will end up impacting blood glucose. Interestingly enough, the expression of a lot of these genes do also change with age. And this is another one of the parallels for how age-associated disorders and blood glucose and diabetes overlap. But there's a lot of threads still to be understood in this, if I'm to be as open as possible about it.
And if I can add to that, I think the most direct relationship between exercise and the effects for diabetes is not through the genetic expression, but it is the direct effect on the glucose levels and the regulation of glucose in through exercise. So I think any theory that would help people to get exercising, I would support that. But I think in this case, the exercise effects are more direct than through the genetic expression.
Yeah, if I can follow up, I want to make sure I say this. So as much as I may nerd out on a given moment about talking about how these mechanisms roll together, there is nothing that comes even close to an intervention about exercise and diet has positive impacts. There's just no doubt about that, right? We can talk about a lot of the science underlying it, and we're still understanding it, but those two things have a benefit. We know it has a benefit.
One of the things that this question reminded me of, Kate, is that although I do not know about an anti-diabetes gene, what I do know is that almost every disorder has genes that predispose one to get it and genes of resilience. So one of the very interesting genetic studies that's going on now is in centenarians. So if you reach 100, what are your genes? And how can we turn that into something that would be useful for all of us to have longer, more productive lives? And those are examples of people who likely have an overrepresentation of the resilience genes. Just to make the more general point that we're looking at genetics of almost every condition that interact with Alzheimer's disease and with other disorders as well.
Right. So I know we have quite a bit of a question and discussion on the exercise and benefit of exercise. So for your information, that in our November session, the 4th Wednesday of November, the topic will be specifically on physical exercise. So that I think that you keep the question coming, and we will be addressing those questions in our November session. So Tessa and Jennifer will be leading that discussion. So we have touched upon a little bit on the nutrition and diet, on the controlling of diabetes and reducing risk for dementia. We have our nutritionist, Dr. Arpita Basu here. She has done tremendous work in this particular area. So I wonder, Peter, if you can share with our audience some key messages from a nutritionist. What can people do to reduce risk and control their diabetes?
Thank you so much, Kate, and for this wonderful opportunity to be part of this great team. And yes, certainly, I think we all understand, as Dr. Jeff Cummings, Dr. just pointed out, and throughout have been re-emphasizing the benefits of diet together with exercise, or diet by itself, because people have got to eat whether or not they exercise. We all love to eat our favorite foods, and some of them are not so healthy, of course. So one of the things, of course, we understand is a healthy diet and dietary patterns. That means not focusing on the overall or focusing on the pattern versus one or two important foods. I'll get to that in a little bit, such as the Mediterranean dietary pattern, which is part of the MIND diet that has been shown to be very helpful in reducing risks of these neurodegenerative diseases. as well as in diabetes. And I'd like to point out the two important mechanisms that the two Jeffs so nicely explained is insulin resistance and inflammation. So in this regard, I think what I would like to point out is, as I'm seeing some of these questions coming through the chat box, is I'd like to stress the importance of plant-based colorful diets. So yes, I think this was a concept that was probably first identified by one of the nutritionists in UCLA, Dr. David Heber. He's sort of one of my nutrition gurus who first identified the importance of the rainbow diet. So the more colors we have in our diet, on our plate, that's what's actually helping with reducing the risks of many of these chronic conditions, because when we think about these colorful groups, such as fruits and vegetables, it's like, oh, they are high in antioxidants. Yes, they are high in antioxidants. And at the same time, those antioxidants can also decrease inflammation. And that's pretty much one of our studies that we recently completed with Dr. Jeff Kinney's lab. We gave them 2 doses of freeze-dried strawberry powder as a concentrated source of antioxidants. And we asked people to simply add those strawberries to their diet. And what we found is after through the period of time, it was a 14-week crossover study, there were significant improvements in their insulin resistance, normalizing blood glucose when they consumed the control, that means no strawberries, versus the strawberry intervention of only 2.5 servings a day. So just to keep in mind, this is within the federal USDA recommendations of 4 to 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. But when we look at the NHANES data of the habitual intake of fruits and vegetables, we're not consuming that. And that's really the challenge. How do we get people to consume? And I'll just share with you some of the comments I get from our participants. Quite interestingly, I have had participants come back and tell me, I don't like to eat my fruits and vegetables, but can I get this freeze-dried strawberry powder? This just tastes so good. I can just add it to my diet. I just like to consume it. It tastes like a strawberry milkshake, like a strawberry ice cream. And sometimes I sprinkle it on my vanilla ice cream. So this is the kind of health behaviors and messages that I always get, which is very interesting. But I think that is where, and I always share it with my dietitian community and students. It's like, I think we've got to make this message of consume your fruits and vegetables more creative, more exciting, and what really helps. So I think that's where I would stop, and if there are any further comments, but definitely eat your colorful fruits and vegetables, and that would help with insulin resistance and inflammation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I may add that the potato is not considered as vegetable by and large. A lot of people think that having potato either mashed, baked, or even French fried, they think it's vegetable. It's not. We are in the coming months in December, Peter. I think that your healthy eating session is going to be in December. So Peter, you will be talking more. I know that you have done a lot of study on the blueberry as well. So Peter is expert in berries and then the benefit of such, both on the diabetes patient as well as on the dementia patient. Obviously, I think that one of the core issue here is the overall sugar control. We know that there are also people talk about, if I eat a lot of fruit, there have a lot of potentially sugars that might also cause potential problems. So I think there will be different kind of selection of fruit and vegetable as well. Again, we will be spending more time talking about that in our December session. So thank you very much for that. There is a question from one of our audience, talk about what's the role of the sleep? Since we have talked about physical exercise, the benefit of such, as well as healthy eating, how important is sleep, both for the prevention and reducing risk for potentially dementia, as well as for diabetes? So on that note, Dr. Cummings, may I ask you to comment first on the role of sleep?
The role of sleep, I can say something about this in Alzheimer's disease, and I'm hoping that someone will know something about this in diabetes because I do not. Well, it's fascinating, Kate, that in the recent years, it's been shown that the clearing of the toxic proteins that appear to cause Alzheimer's disease are cleared from the brain during sleep. And we know that poor sleep is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, just as diabetes is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And here we have a pretty solid mechanistic observation that the protein that accumulates and eventually causes Alzheimer's disease is cleared from the brain. In fact, both proteins that cause Alzheimer's disease are cleared from the brain during sleep. So if we do not allow a sufficient time for that clearing process to occur, we will exaggerate the accumulation of these proteins, which lead to the death of nerve cells. And it is that loss of nerve cells then which constitutes the memory problems of Alzheimer's disease. And of course, eventually overcome the patient completely and they succumb to the disease. So the sleep is really important. It's something that we have just recently come to appreciate more fully.
Thank you, Dr. Cummings. If I may add to that, there have been a lot of studies on the benefit of sleep, but particularly the duration and the overall quality of sleep. I think that a recent ARP published a guideline specifically addressing the need for a good night's sleep. For the adult, the recommended duration is between 6.5 hours to about 7.5 hours. And that could be cumulatively within 24-hour period. So that means if you only sleep about 6 hours during the night, you can take 1 hour nap during the day. That still would count for a total of 7 hours sleep. And then for the elderly folks, they tend to nap a bit more regularly. One of the recommendations is don't take nap too often and too long. Then the third issue is the use of the hypnotic, like sleeping pill on the overall cognitive function. And then there have been some studies just suggesting that if you don't have to use a sleeping pill, ideally to build up a much better sleep, what we call the sleep hygiene, and then that would be much better. Overall. Dr. Cummings, any comment on the sleep and diabetes?
Yeah, I just add just to what Dr. Cummings had highlighted. So not only is there this really important piece of clearing the amyloid and the tau, so those are these two toxic proteins, but during sleep, and in particular in different stages of sleep, there actually are changes in all sorts of things like body temperature and metabolism. And these actually favor resetting some inflammatory processes, right? So it's not a coincidence that there's overlap in a lot of these same systems that keep on reemerging here. There is a true benefit to your inflammatory baseline and how you respond to being well rested. And to step into my other colleagues here, good exercise is associated with better regulation of sleep and sleep stages. So again, we're talking about a continuum here that is completely overlapping and interrelated, and all sort of point to disruption of one can disrupt others. But good diet and good exercise leads to good sleep, which leads to good removal of toxic proteins and resetting of the immune system. They are an overlapping and interconnected group.
Thank you, Dr. Kenny. Another question is, are there any negative effects of having too much sleep on the brain? I think that before we jump onto that, I just want to comment quickly that for people who tend to sleep a lot, I think that is very important to get a medical assessment, because there are a lot of people who have what we considered sleep disorders, such as sleep apnea, that they really didn't get really restful sleep during the night. So therefore that they feel tired, they feel not rested. They tend to take frequent naps and they tend to sleep more, but because partially due to very poor sleep quality. So Dr. Cummings, any comment on potential negative impact or effect of having too much sleep?
I'd make 2 points. One is the amount of sleep that one needs is highly variable from individual to individual. So there might be people who, for whom 10 hours is more like their normal sleep pattern. And the other is that as Alzheimer's disease progresses, people tend to sleep more. And I see that as a negative effect, a negative outcome of the disease. But there are definite, in addition to the effect of sleep on Alzheimer's, there's also the effect of Alzheimer's on sleep.
Thank you. Well, people have a lot of interest on the sleep topic, so I'm glad you do, because next month in October, our topic will be on emotional well-being and sleep. So join us, and we will incorporate some of the questions into our next month's forum discussion. Quickly, another question we have here is the benefit of the role of mental exercise on memory. Dr. Cummings, I wonder if you can take that on.
Sure, and I'm sure our occupational therapists also have opinions about this. What I would say is that the evidence points to the benefits of continuing an active mental life. And it's pretty general because the measures are pretty general in those studies. So it would be very difficult to say specifically that lumosity or origami or crossword puzzles are the way to have a better mental life. What is generally true is that the more active and engaged we are, the less likely we are to experience Alzheimer's. And one of my very favorite studies done by a former fellow of mine, a woman who became very interested in the effect of purpose of life on the likelihood of getting Alzheimer's disease. And she showed very clearly that people who live lives of purpose and who are committed to social good or whatever it is that their purpose is, are less likely to manifest cognitive decline in the course of a long life.
Thank you, Dr. Cummings. I want to add to that question as well. Again, AARP has published guideline on this very topic as well. So the consensus from the expert is such that practicing on lumosity and some other like apps will just make you do better on lumosity and that specific app. But that particular skill set will not be transferred to the other cognitive ability or function. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. However, that as Dr. Cummings pointed out, that keeping engaged with purposeful activity, social engagement, learning new language, developing a new hobby, all that can really help to stimulate the overall brain. So that will be good for your brain health. Great. So Jeff, I wonder if you can comment a little bit in terms of the current trend on the clinical trial using the drugs treating diabetes now in the effort to treat Alzheimer's. I found that's a fascinating area.
Yeah, this is really a hot area now, Kate, called bioenergetics and metabolism is the general class of drugs. And there are several anti-diabetic drugs that are being tested for Alzheimer's disease. One that I've been involved in is called semaglutide. And this is a specific drug, and it's given to diabetics in recent years. And when they look at the dementia risk in the patients who received this drug, versus diabetic patients who did not receive this drug, there was less dementia in those who received this specific type of anti-dementia intervention. So now that's being tested in a large global trial, 2 large global trials actually. But even older drugs like metformin appear to have brain health and even longevity effects. And these are being studied in clinical trials. Metformin is also being studied in clinical trials as well. There have been a lot of negative trials but our trial methodology is continuing to improve, and the drugs that we're choosing to study are continuing to be more promising.
Thank you, Jeff. This is a great discussion. We have a lot of questions. And so we, as I said, that we have ongoing sessions every month on the fourth Wednesday. And so that we will be addressing a lot of questions people are asking and continue to really share information and some of the most up-to-date knowledge as well. I do want to mention that on October 16th, that we do have an Alzheimer's walk. If people are interested in signing up and joining us and get your 10,000 step in to help raise awareness. And also that we have our Facebook and social media and website. Okay, how do we sign up for that? Andy, can you comment on that? How do people sign up for the Alzheimer's walk?
I'm actually going to kick that over to Brain Health because it is their team.
The Brain Health team, okay.
Yes. So
yes.
I can field that one really quickly. So the Alzheimer's Association has a website. So if you go to Alzheimer's Association in a Google search, you will find information about the Walk to End Alzheimer's, and it's being held out at the ballpark in Summerlin. We actually have a Team Brain Health that anyone's welcome to join, but also anybody else who wants to walk. And it's a really well orchestrated event every single year.
I do know that there is something posted on the School of Integrated Health Facebook page. So UNLV, UNLV SIHS on Facebook. It's pinned to the top of our page. But if you, actually, I'm going to put a couple of things in the chat here. And
thank you, Andy, for that. People can take a look in the chat session. In our last few minutes, I'd like to first of all thank to all our participants and our panelists. I would like to get just few last words from our two speakers, Dr. Kenny and Dr. Cummings. So what would be one key message that you would like to convey to our audience today? Dr. Kenny, I'm going to start from you.
Okay. One key message would be that while there may be a number of things that confer risk for things like Alzheimer's disease, there are certainly things that you can do. And I hope it's really sort of resonated throughout this call that, you know, diabetes is a concern, but you can be tested for your blood glucose levels and know it. Exercise and diet and engaging your brain all have benefits. So it's not a pessimistic view. It's that there's things that you can do, and there's lots of good information out there that you can tap into.
Thank you. Dr. Cummings?
Yes, I would just echo exactly what Jeff said and echo exactly the nature of the program you put together today, Kate, that a substantial amount of the risk for cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease is under our own control. And that through diet and exercise and taking care of vascular risk factors and getting good sleep, we are able to reduce our risk for late life cognitive decline, and we should. This is not the way we want to end our lives with cognitive impairment. So this is really worth the investment, and it has to start early. I see some young people in our group here, and the younger you start, the more enduring the effect will be.
Well, speaking of the young people, we also have Amanda here, our graduate student who has been working under Dr. Kenny's and really studying the different roles, including obviously inflammation on dementia and diabetes. So as we are coming to the end here, I want to thank you again. So this is Brain Health and You. So take control of your life. And there's so many things you can do to really reduce risk, both for diabetes and for dementia. We look forward to seeing all of you in about 4 weeks. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Kate.
folks, yes, thank you so much. A few housekeeping items.
Yes.
For those of you who haven't already registered for the upcoming speaker series in October, November, and December, the link, I'm putting that in the chat right there. You can register it at engage.unlv.edu/brain health. And you can register for any of the 3 events that are still up and coming. Also, if you happen to have any questions that may not have been answered today or pop up after we finish, I'm also putting in the chat an email where you can send those questions, and we will be sure to address them in an upcoming forum at unlv.edu.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
Sure
Thank
thing.
you, everyone.
Okay, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Events. Can probably stop recording now.